In this video, I'd like to go over 3 types that I consider to be the weakest types in all of Pokemon, and see what we can do to improve them. And those types are going to be Ice, Rock, and Bug. So let's start with the Ice type. So I really like the Ice type. I think it's a really cool type, no pun intended. But it's famously the worst defensive typing in the game, though Rock comes pretty close. So it's weak to Fire, Fighting, Rock, and Steel, and only resists itself. Not that great, but it's really good offensively, beating things like Grass, Flying, Ground, and famously Dragon. And before the Fairy type, it was the best type to take down Dragon. Unfortunately, the Fairy type came into existence and Ice kind of lost its big niche. But it's still a really good attacking type. But the problem is you can always use a Water type or something, because pretty much all Water types can learn Ice moves, and Water's one of the best types. So why use Ice? Well, the only reason is to be a Glass Cannon. The best Ice types are Glass Cannons. Pokemon like Weavile, and that new one in Scarlet Violet that looks like a saber-toothed tiger, I forget its name, but it's basically the new Weavile. Yeah, that's the best you can do, because you're not going to be able to take a hit. So the best you can do is do as much damage as quick as possible. So, what can we do to improve the Ice type? Well, it needs more resistances. I'm not going to say take away its weaknesses, because they all make sense. You know, Ice is brittle, it's fragile, it breaks easily, so it makes sense to be weak to all those types. But why doesn't it resist more things? Like, why doesn't it resist Dragon? Doesn't that make sense? If it beats Dragon, shouldn't it be resisted to it? That's how Pokemon usually works. It doesn't resist Grass or Flying or Ground. I mean, it kind of makes sense that it doesn't resist any of those, except Grass I think could work. I think it should resist Grass. But it should really resist Dragon, and why doesn't it resist Water? That would make sense. Water it resists ice because it's just frozen water. But you throw water on ice, the water's just going to freeze. So shouldn't it be resistant to it? No, actually, it should be immune. Because if water on it is just freezing and becoming ice, it should be immune. Imagine if ice had a water immunity. That'd be amazing. I mean, look at Pokemon like Gastrodon with Storm Drain or other Pokemon with Water Absorb. You know, being immune to water, one of the most common types out there and one of the best types out there, that would be amazing. Its viability would skyrocket because one of Ice's biggest problems is that it can't come in on anything because it can't take a hit. But if it had a resistance or an immunity to water, it'd be amazing. So that's how I think we should improve the Ice type, because when you put more types on top of the Ice types, usually you just add more weaknesses, like Ice Flying or Ice Grass or pretty much Ice anything. Ice does not cover any kind of weakness because it only resists itself. The best it can bring to the table is a resistance to Ice, but so what? It brings so many weaknesses that it's just not worth it. So I think a buff like those resistances or immunities would definitely make sense. Also, we need more Ice types to be Glass Cannons, because a slow Ice type that's trying to be a defensive tank like Avalugg or something just doesn't work, because not only does Avalugg has terrible special defense, which is terrible for a tank, but with such a terrible defensive profiling, it doesn't matter what your defensive stats are. You're going to get blown away no matter what. Those types that it's weak to are just too common. So yeah, that's what I would do to help out the Ice type. Let's move on to the Rock type. So the biggest problem with the Rock type is that they're slow and they have a ton of weaknesses. Much like the Ice type, they are a terrible defensive typing, which is weird because it's a rock. You think it'd be sturdy, but no, it's not. And the only reason it's not worse than the Ice type is that it actually does have a few more resistances. Granted, it still has more weaknesses than resistances, which is a terrible thing for a defensive type to have. So, how do we improve it? Well, I don't think we can take away any of its weaknesses, because all of its weaknesses make sense. But it should have more resistances. Its only resistances are Normal, Fire, Poison, and Flying. But why isn't it resistant to stuff like Bug? You know, it's super effective against Bug. So why isn't it resisted? You know, why doesn't it resist it? Or something like that. And it has plenty of resistances already. Well, actually not plenty, there's only 4. So it should have 1 to Bug. And there might be 1 or 2 that you can make a case for. But I think the real problem with the Rock type is that it's slow. I think what they should really do, because Rock is a pretty good, much like Ice, is a good offensive typing. Rock Slide and Stealth Rock are used a lot in competitive, in singles and doubles, depending. Stealth Rock good in singles, Rock Slide good in doubles, but they're never coming off rock Pokemon. They're always coming off ground Pokemon or something like that. And that's the other thing. Rock is just outclassed by two other types. First, ground, which are usually faster and can use rock type moves, and steel, which is just way better defensively. This steel is basically the type rock wish it could be, because steel is the best defensive typing in the game. So if you got steel, why would you use a rock type? So what should we do? Well, the rock type needs to fill its own niche kind of thing. Like, okay, steel types are meant to be tanks. Ice types are supposed to be glass cannons because of the way their typing is. Rock types should be glass cannons too. I know that sounds weird. It's like, well, they're rocks. They shouldn't be fast. But look at one of the Pokemon I have up here, Onix. Did you know its second best stat is its speed? Yeah. Defense is its best one, which you'd expect. But next up is speed. And what about Lycanroc, the midday form? That speed is, it has a speed stat of 112. 112. Do you know how many Pokemon that outspeeds? A lot. So it's not impossible. Now, granted, that speed didn't make it competitively viable, but still, I think if you did that and gave, if some rock Pokemon had more speed, they would probably be a bit more competitively viable. But it's hard to say because, again, it's just such a terrible typing. But if it can't do the one thing it's supposed to do, which is take hits, because see, here's the reason I think these three types are the weakest. I like to do playthroughs of single type runs, mono runs, if you want to call it. And I found the hardest types to do were ice, rock, and bug. For different reasons, granted. Ice not only is terrible defensively, but they're also kind of hard to find. So sometimes your options are limited. But it really was the typing and the weaknesses and lack of resistances that really made those playthroughs hard. And then the rock type, the biggest problem was all the weaknesses and not being able to strike first. I was always outsped and usually getting hit with something that I was weak to, because Rocks has so many common weaknesses. Water and grass alone in most games, those are so common. I'm not talking competitive here. Like just normal games, it's like water and grass are so common, and being slower than everything, you get killed before you can do anything. So that low speed on most rock types is so terrible, especially since you can't take hits, and most of them have terrible special defense. So they couldn't be a tank even if they wanted to, because unless you're going up against the four types it resists, which isn't a lot, you're not doing your job as a tank. And I've noticed a lot of them don't even have that great HP, which is weird. Again, rock type just is not built for defense, really, ironically. So you need to make them stronger and faster. A lot of them have good attack, but it doesn't matter if you can't even get off an attack. So I think the rock type needs a few more resistances, and it needs to be faster. That's the only way it can be somewhat usable, because as is, it just can't do the task that it was originally supposed to be, which is a tank. If you have so much weaknesses, you're not a tank, you're a sitting duck. So they need to be glass cannons. That's the only way I can think that they could really improve themselves, because they're just getting outclassed by two other types in the game. Now finally, let's move on to the bug type. So the bug type is interesting. One of my favorite runs I ever did, actually, was my Sword and Shield run of all bug types. It's because I actually had to use a lot of strategy in order to win. I couldn't just brute force my way through it. And that was actually really fun. It's actually really fun when you can use strategy. What a novel concept. Pokemon, you should look into that. But anyway, so the bug type, unlike the ice and rock type, actually does not have a ton of weaknesses. It's only weak to three types, which is fire, flying, and rock. And granted, it's only super effective against a few types, being grass, psychic, and dark. But psychic and dark are pretty notable. The grass one, not so much, because, well, the grass type has a ton of weaknesses. But what really hurts the bug type is how many types are resistant to it. It has a ton of types that are resistant to it, some of which do not make sense. Like, I get fire, flying, and, rock. Is it resistant to rock? I don't know. No, it's not. I just talked about that. No, so I get fire and flying and stuff. But what I don't get is the resistance by fighting. That's a bit weird. And Ghost and Fairy. Why does Ghost and Fairy resist Bug? They're not super effective against Bug. Bug isn't super effective against them or anything. Like, it just doesn't make any sense. Like, what's the Ghost and Fairy? And again, the fighting one doesn't make sense either. I guess the fighting one is justified by like, oh, well, you smack bugs, right? You kill them by smacking them on your arm or something like that, but that's still a huge stretch, you know? So I don't get that. I think that's what we need to do to make bug types a bit better, is take away some of those types that are resistant to it, because they just make no sense. Also, the other thing you can do is make them stronger. The bug type, famously, I think, has the lowest overall stat line of any type in the game, which, yeah, of course, makes sense for some of them, you know, Caterpie, Weedle, and all that other stuff, all those really weak, low-level grub-type Pokemon, you know, that makes sense. But the final evolutions and stuff, they could use a little bit of a buff in terms of their stats. That's the main reason I don't think they're used. Well, that and the fact so many things resist them. You know, you don't see a ton of bug-type moves flying around, but you can see some bug-type moves like Quiver Dance and, you know, Mega Horn and stuff like that. But usually a bug-type second typing is helpful, and only a few actually have the stats to actually be competitive. And I get it, you know, some of them are supposed to be early game Pokemon. They evolve quickly, and they're good for the beginning, but not so much later. But I do think there are some that, you know, could have... They need buffs, you know? Now, granted, they've been a lot better recently. Recently, there have been a lot of bug types that are actually really good, but there's still a lot that need some catching up. You know, they could use a little buffs in their stats, and not so many types that resist them. I think that just those small little changes would make the bug type actually way better than it already is. It's not that bad. Like, my all-bug playthroughs have really taught me, you know what, they're not that bad. You got to use a lot more strategy, but they're actually really fun. I actually have grown to love the bug type a lot more than I used to. I used to think they were worthless. Now I'm like, oh, you know what? They're actually really, really fun. So that's what I do to improve these three types. But what would you do to improve all these types? Let me know in the comments, and I'll see you next time.